Let's talk about psycho killers. Hi, I'm Shemaya. It's like papaya, except it's not, and this is Plot Twist Please, a place where I use pop culture in order to make our brains a little cozier. If you know anything about my content, you probably guessed that I'm using the term psycho facetiously, because, psycho is actually a really insensitive term. Why is it that we as humans like stuff that scares us? I am talking to humans, right? You're not like AI. Hello? Not if you're a real person. Okay, good. I'm starting to get worried. Artificial intelligence, Anyway, fellow humans, let's get back to the main course. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say that if you are someone who gets irritated by people bringing analytical devices into things that are supposed to be forms of escapism, media, television, film, things of that nature, I hate to say it, but this channel probably isn't going to be your cup of tea. In this house, we think that culture is a reflection of media and vice versa. By the way, I'm going to include the thriller horror genres interchangeably when I see fit in this video. So cry about it. If you're still here, onward we go. First off, let's hear from our experts, because I can't do all this myself. Amanda Fontaine, the Politics, Law, and Society lecturer whose research focuses on criminology and medical sociology, come on PhD, stated in an interview on a Bryant University publication that she enjoys feeling fear while watching horror movies. Whether she's seen a religious horror film like The Omen or a monster movie like The Relic, Fontaine explains in the interview how fear triggers an adrenaline release that leaves thrill seekers like her with increased sensations. Amidst these responses, Fontaine notes that people may be drawn to this genre as a coping mechanism or as a result of a subconscious desire to grapple with death and violence. We love coping mechanisms over here. We know them very well. She says people are scared of their own mortality, but they like to see death play out and explore ideas of what it looks like and what happens next. So viewing these topics safely through the lens of film can help give people a sense of relief, kind of like how the lion in the cage is fascinating, whereas a real world lion in front of you in the wild or safari might give you a heart attack. It's all a show. There's no danger, very yada da da da, nothing to see here, boop boo top hat. Fontaine goes on to say that there's always a boundary that lets people get right up to the edge of some uncomfortable feelings while still being safe enough to walk away. Fontaine, I agree. So, since we now know that people gravitate toward topics that are, quote, taboo, i.e. prohibited or typically avoided within social custom, as long as there isn't a real tangible threat, let's talk about the caveat. I'd argue that, the whole people are interested in what is uncomfortable thing is true to an extent. For example, movies like Splice or The Human Centipede have to do with topics that are so uncomfy, so niche, that it might leave a lot of its audience saying, yeah, there are some thrillers and or films in the horror genre that make me go, why would someone do this? And how did someone sit in a board meeting and sign off on this? Someone in a suit said yes to this. Spark notes. If you want to scare your audience while still making them want to watch, make the subject matter taboo, but not too taboo. Include something that feels wrong to be thinking about, but not too wrong. After looking at lots of different reviews of thriller and horror movies that seem to not get the balance right with audiences, I've come up with 3 potential reasons as to why a horror movie might miss the mark with its audience. Let's ignore the part where sometimes the story isn't compelling or there are plot holes. That's an easy discussion to have. Right now, we're tackling the more difficult discussion. So, these 3 potential reasons I've come up with, outside of those I just listed, are the following. 1, it is unnecessarily gory. 2, it doesn't sit well with agreed upon societal values of the audience. And 3, it triggers actual individual traumas in a lasting harmful way. So let's start with the first one. 1, it is unnecessarily gory. Listen, y'all, I'm going to try and put my own personal feelings aside in order to talk about this, because if you've been subscribed to this channel for a minute, you know that I do not, shall not, have not fared well with a lot of gore. Frankly, I tend to think that a lot of gore in thrillers and horror movies alike tend to be included for cheap shock value and rarely based on any thematic, plot-driven, or allegorical intention, which, as a self-proclaimed film nerd, makes me feel a little bit of indigestion. But enough about me. Let's hear from the community.
Why do horror movies always have, unnecessary sexual assault scenes? Honestly. I guess I understand, when it's like, oh, you know, it's just to add to the emotions and make you uncomfortable. Like, it's supposed to make you uncomfortable. That's the point. But like, I don't think it's really not necessary. It's really, like, the ones that, like, actually show it. Like, it's one thing to, like, talk about it. Like, I don't even know. It's unnecessary. It doesn't.
So, aside from criticism generally pointing to the unnecessary and almost indulgent gore, there are often concerns about the societal implications of who ends up bearing the brunt of such intense gore and violence. From portraying harm toward women and other minorities in extremely insensitive ways to seemingly intentionally using this violence on an excessive level, there seems to be cause for concern. That brings me to number 2. The second reason as to why a horror movie might flop, I've discovered, is because it doesn't jive with the mainstream societal values at the time of its release. For example, Jennifer's Body is a film that I think has been more appreciated in recent years versus when it first came out. Now, I could go into a whole study on like how and why that is. Maybe that's another video. I don't think I will make a video on that. I think other people have made better videos on that than I could, but that's just an example. Another general example, I guess, of this is, in my opinion, how the public perception of American Psycho has evolved over the years. Aside from mainstream public perception, there are films that I personally have found to be distasteful for reasons that I am aware haven't quite reached the mainstream consciousness. And, you know, that can be a little frustrating. That can be just a little tiring. But, you know, that's the gag. That's the gag when ableism is everywhere. Especially when such films and tropes within those films tend to harm actual people. And mind you, this is harm I've seen with my own 2 eyes. This isn't just things that I am assuming happen. These are things that I've seen happening. Are you getting the picture yet? Is the image blurry still? If so, don't fret, for it's time for me to call upon one of my favorite tropes in film, the crazy psycho killer. That's sarcasm. A writer from NightmareMagazine.com, which is an independent publication, says, many of our villains and some protagonists are, quote, crazy. This is a catch-all term for anyone whose personal reality doesn't match the traditional or popular definition of reality, and they're usually extreme. Maybe they hallucinate, for example, Videodrome. Maybe they're delusional and at times believe themselves to be another person entirely. Psycho, Friday the 13th are examples of that trope. Maybe they just think murder is fun. Mental illnesses, on the other hand, currently include everything from depression and anxiety to drugs and alcohol addiction to schizophrenia. It's clear that most of 20th century horror film and fiction have no idea what schizophrenia actually is, often confusing it with dissociative identity disorder, DID for short, also formerly known as multiple personality disorder. So where does this trope come from? Why are these assumptions constantly being made? The idea of a bloodthirsty killer tucked into the fragmented psyche of a mild-mannered neighbor is at least as old as the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. 1886. Many villains in the classic horror genres and in other genres have also turned out to be people with visible physical disabilities. And now I'm about to call out some of your favorites, but please don't dox me, y'all. Still gotta work in this town. Think Hook, for example, or a villain with a glass eye. Now, just to set the record straight, do I think that all people who are disabled or mentally ill need to be portrayed as perfect angels in order for it to be, quote, good representation? No. Good representation is simply human representation. Disabled people can be just as nefarious as non-disabled people and just as innocent as well. Balance is the point. We love balance. And lack of balance has real world consequences. Which brings me to the third reason a horror movie might upset audiences, triggering actual traumas in a long-lasting, I think the word I'm looking for is tangible way. Okay, tangible. We know words, we read books, we do. As an autistic person, though I don't have experience with personality disorders, I can at the very least find symmetry with how less mainstream mental disorders and disabilities are portrayed in film and TV. When I say, quote, less mainstream, I mean anything other than what is acceptable to talk about in most social circles. So that's outside of anxiety and in some cases ADHD. Those I would say are less taboo than narcissistic personality disorder, for example, or schizophrenia. I would say that autism isn't as stigmatized as schizophrenia, honestly. I'll just be honest about that. I feel more comfortable talking about that than I think somebody would who was schizophrenic. especially in front of a camera that is, for people to look on their little window screens and know everything about me. And I think also, since a lot of people don't have people in their lives who are schizophrenic, or at the very least, people who talk about their experiences with schizophrenia, it's easy to pass around misinformation. The victims of a mental health crisis, in turn, become the villains in these scenarios because we don't know very much about them publicly. And people with these illnesses resort to suffering alone, which is not ideal. Community care, along with psychological help from professionals and sometimes medication, can be the difference between whether or not those people stay alive. So yeah, the effects are very real. So what's the solution, Shemaya? You're gabbing and chatting about all the problems. Let's talk about solutions. Well, honestly, there is none. We all die alone. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. The solution is we keep talking about our experiences if we are on the margins and keep expanding our capacity to empathize with people who are often demonized in media culture. Try to visualize people who have mental illnesses or mental disorders or disabilities that are not as socially accepted as victims rather than villains, because they are victims. And besides the word psycho being a reflection of an ableist culture, frankly, I find that word not particularly useful. I mean, are they, quote, psycho, or are they a victim of a society that doesn't support affordable mental health accommodations? Methinks it's the latter.
Shakespeare, we've got some thespians in the audience. Let me hear you, Chicago.
But yeah, I do actually need to retract a statement I made in the last 2 minutes. We do actually die alone. So sorry about that. Anyways, that's all I have for you today. So do me a solid and hit that like button. Be blessed and stay weird.